Welcome to Phenomenon Radio, the show that covers thought-provoking breakthroughs in the fields of UAP UFOs to discover fascinating truths, first-hand accounts, and investigative insights into the expanding confluence of physical and mental exposure to this worldwide phenomenon. Hosted by Emmy award-winning investigative journalists, Earthfiles reporter and editor Linda Moulton Howe, and world-renowned experiencer of the 1980 Rendlesham Bentwaters incident, John Burroughs. And now, leading off tonight's program, here's Linda Moulton Howe.
Since 1935, the back of United States dollar bills have had the symbol of a circle around a 13-layered pyramid in which the triangular capstone is separated above the pyramid and glows with light around maybe human eye. Above the separated capstone are the Latin words annuit septus, that translates as "He has favored our undertaking." History scholars assume that he refers to God. The 13-layered pyramid, topped by the disconnected and glowing capstone, rests on ground where a banner displays more Latin words, Novus Order Seclorum. That Latin is translated as a new order of ages or a new world order. Those words were used by President George H.W. Bush, the Elder, to describe on September 11th, 1990, before a joint session of the United States Congress, his post-Cold War agenda to cooperate with the collapsed Soviet Union. Bush told Congress, quote, "Until now, the world we've known has been a world divided, a world of barbed wire and concrete block, conflict, and Cold War. And now we can see a new world coming into view, a world in which there is the very real prospect of a new world order. In the words of Winston Churchill, a world order in which the principles of justice and fair play protect the weak against the strong," close quote. The next year, in 1991, American televangelist Pat Robertson released a best-selling book that echoed Bush and Churchill with its title, The New World Order. Robertson described a scenario where Wall Street, the Federal Reserve System, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderberg Group, and the Trilateral Commission are controlling the flow of world events behind the scenes. Are they manipulating the Earth's human population deliberately to keep people dumb and blind in order to secretly manipulate the world to move politically, economically, and socially toward a one-world government controlled by what Pat Robertson called evil agendas? Nearly a decade before the Great Recession hit, in 2000, best-selling author Jim Marrs released Rule by Secrecy, the hidden history that connects the Trilateral Commission, the Freemasons, and the Great Pyramids. In his book, Jim dug deeply into the history of secret societies and the power they have wielded for centuries up to modern-day conspiracies. Jim's conclusion was that behind the scenes of world political and economic affairs, there are hidden forces that manipulate stock markets, keep the rich rich and the poor poor, and even control what headlines get to the 6 o'clock news. Jim Marrs connected many dots that link modern control agencies to the ancient Freemasons, Illuminati, Knights Templar, and the Middle East pyramid and ziggurat builders of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Today, on a planet of 7.2 billion and counting humans, the people who actually own and control how and where money flows on Earth, Jim said, are only a few hundred, less than 1%. Now, UK best-selling author Nick Redfern, who lives in Dallas, Texas, has created a compendium about 200 organizations, events, symbols, individuals, and pop culture references that Nick places in alphabetical order in his latest release, The New World Order Book. In his introduction, Nick writes, quote, "While we are assured by our leaders that any potential New World Order will be wholly benign and beneficial in nature, all of the facts strongly suggest otherwise. The New World Order is not just about modeling the future, however. It's also about dumbing down the population to ensure they become ignorant of the past," close quote. Nick Redfern was born in Pelsall, Staffordshire, England, 53 years ago in 1964. After attending Pelsall Comprehensive School, he began magazine writing that led to freelance work for local newspapers, and by 2001, his byline had reached British newsstand magazines such as The Weekender and Military Illustrated. Using FOIA requests, Nick has worked to uncover previously classified World War II Royal Air Force, Air Ministry, and UK Ministry of Defence files on UFOs, or as they say in the UK, UAPs. Nick has authored a dozen books since 1997, including The NASA Conspiracies and the British Government's UFO Top Secrets Exposed. He currently is a feature writer and contributing editor for the UK's Phenomena magazine. After this short break, Phenomenon Radio will return to begin our discussion tonight with Nick Redfern about his list of 200 players currently driving humanity to a new world order that could solidify the self-serving 1% control of Earth.
Thank you all for joining us here on Phenomenon Radio Live on KGRA, The Planet. Phenomenon Live special guest Nick Redfern will join the show right after these messages. Don't go anywhere.
It's AJ with Vibes, Mind, Body, Spirit. The Vibes Tribe seeks to assist you in creating and maintaining an uplifting and balanced state of being in your personal space. Palo Santo is a mystical tree that grows on the coast of South America. Palo is loved by many for its energetic, cleansing, and healing properties, and is also popularized for its heavenly presence in keeping your energy grounded and clear. Burning Palo provides an uplifting scent to raise your vibration and is also beneficial for relieving stress, anxiety, depression, and emotional pain. Palo Santo is also known for relieving symptoms of the common cold, headaches, and asthma. We offer Palo Santo in resin, powder, or by the stick. Go to onlinevibes.com for all of your vibration elevation needs and receive a free stick of Palo Santo with any online purchase over $25. Shop onlinevibes.com, that's onlinevibez.com, and get your vibes on today.
Not on my watch, our military service members say, as they volunteer to serve, as they move out, stand firm, and take fire. So not on our watch, we say, to the severely ill or injured veterans who can't get the care they deserve to live full and independent lives, even when there's no government funding or a nursing home seems like the only option. We won't leave one warrior behind. Not on our watch. Join us at findwwp.org.
Mainstream media's most wanted. KGRAradio.com.
Thanks for joining us tonight on Phenomenon Radio Live for tonight's interview with very special and long-awaited return of guest Nick Redfern. To start tonight's interview, here's Linda Moulton Howe. Linda?
Thanks, Race. And Nick Redfern, welcome to Phenomenon Radio. I am so glad we were able to get past the chaos of weather and all of the things that happen, and that you are here because the whole subject of New World Order is becoming more relevant every single day with what is happening around our globe. And I thought that tonight, one of the more important quotes in your new book is from the 28th President of the United States. It was a whole century ago, but he perfectly seemed to sum up what is now the suspicions of this modern world about the phrase New World Order. Who or what is really behind the scenes pulling so many strings of America and this planet? And the president that I'm talking about that you quoted was Democrat Woodrow Wilson, who served in the White House from 1913 to 1921. And during his 1912 campaign, he used the slogan, "The New Freedom," running against Theodore Roosevelt's New Nationalism. And in his 1913 book, The New Freedom, President Wilson warned, "Some of the biggest men in the United States in the field of commerce and manufacture are afraid of somebody, are afraid of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it." Close quote. Could you begin tonight with your current thoughts about who or what in the big picture has woven human history through the secret forces of the ancient Freemasons and Illuminati and Knights Templar and the Middle East Pyramid and ziggurat builders of Egypt and Mesopotamia all the way up to now, this 21st century?
Yeah, I think, when the term New World Order is used, it means different things to different people depending on your own perspective. Now, today, I think for many people, you mentioned the word New World Order, and people sort of point their fingers at this government or that government, and there's a lot of like finger pointing. But for me, I think what we're dealing with is not sort of a specific government doing this or doing that. I honestly do think that the New World Order, what's going on behind the scenes, is driven very much by powerful figures who are outside of elected governments, but who have the ability to infiltrate and influence elected governments, to the point where government agencies and elected governments may actually not realize the extent to which they're being manipulated by these sort of hidden hands. So I don't personally, unlike some conspiracy theorists, I don't view, this government or that government as evil, or anything like that. But I do believe there are dangerous, powerful figures behind the scenes who are doing their utmost to, take away our freedoms bit by bit and our privacy bit by bit, and to the point where 10 years, 20 years down the line, you think, wow, the world's totally different to how it was 20 years ago. And yet it's not because there's no jackbooted troops knocking at our front door or kicking the doors down. It's being done in a very subtle, slow way. And we're not really even realizing it at times as to what's going on. And I think that's the dangerous thing about it. But I do think a lot of it is driven by powerful societies, big business, people who really, the real sort of power brokers on the planet, who very often skillfully operate in a behind-the-scenes fashion, and to the point where most people aren't even aware they exist. And so everything is pointed towards government rather than, ironically, these people are actually outside of government.
And the question that has been raised, at least in the last decade, is how much of the 1% are actually not human, whether they're hybrids, whether they are a full prime extraterrestrial influence. What is your perspective on the possibility that the 1% running Earth, truly running Earth, is not even human?
Well, I mean, it's a controversial area, but you do get stories like this. I mean, I get a lot of accounts from people who talk about alien-human hybrids, but not just in relation to the alien abduction phenomenon where people talk about hybrid babies and hybrid children, but over the years I've been given a number of stories from people who claim to have, knowledge of very human-looking extraterrestrials sort of working their way into society, and not necessarily from a positive perspective. And kind of tying in with that is the whole reptilian angle. Now, I think the whole, the reptilian issue, if you like, the controversy, polarizes people into two camps, those who believe it has validity and those who think it's nonsense. But I have to say, again, I've got stories and accounts from very credible people who swear that they saw, somebody who looked completely human, and then there was suddenly this sort of, almost like a heat haze, like a shimmering, and they briefly turned into sort of like an upright reptilian type creature. And the people who I've spoken to, they come across just regular people. If you talk about any other subject, you would not even question it. And when you put these stories together, the idea of sort of an elite running the planet, which may not be entirely human, then we get down some really dark and disturbing pathways. The idea that we think, we are our own masters, so to speak, when we're actually not seeing, the full picture. It's the whole issue of not being able to see the woods for the trees, so to speak. And I think there's a great deal to that. The idea that reality and history and the way the world is run, we see it from one perspective, but it's actually not the real perspective, or at least not the full perspective.
Yes, and Jim and I individually, we had encountered and talked directly with people who were eyewitnesses. In one case, Jim Mars called me and said, I've just talked with a person you have to call and a number. And there was a series of various stories that we had from we'll call them eyewitnesses, and one that kind of fit a mold that Jim was encountering was the daughter of a very successful Texas politician who had an office on a tall, high floor of one of those big skyscrapers in Dallas. And she had gone to her father's office to go to lunch. And the short story form is she came through her father's office door. He was at his big desk at the end of his large office that had windows all around a corner. And he waved like, I'm on the phone. I'll be with you in a minute. And she liked looking out of the windows in his office and said that she walked to one of the windows, was staring down at the traffic and the people and the rest of the buildings down in Dallas. And then just suddenly, she just turned like she was going to tap her watch to her father's, like meaning it's time to go. And when she turned, who was standing there in the clothes were there, but she said it was an alligator with scales, the prominent nose, everything. And she was so shocked that what she did was continue right back out the door, waving at her father. And now this is really weird. When she told Jim and me, she said she never once confronted her father about what she saw in his office. And we've run into that before, where people have seen the transitions and they're afraid to say anything. And it gets to this big question of how much is mind control, like MK Ultra, how much is technology, how much is something that we don't comprehend. And this goes diving into your book, into R. Your book is organized alphabetically. And I thought I would go into starting in the letter R at the Rand Corporation. We've all heard about that for decades. We know that the Rand Corporation was involved in papers at some point for our government, even related to the UFO story at one point. And in your R section, you say, when it comes to the matter of government interest in paranormal phenomena, certainly one of the most controversial aspects of the entire issue revolves around the way and means by which official agencies have exploited or have tried to exploit religious iconography as a weapon of war, deception, and manipulation. Could you please share with us everything you know about Project Bluebeam Rand Corporation in the context of now?
Well, yeah, I mean, Rand's involvement, Rand is basically sort of one of the world's most influential and powerful think tanks, basically. You know, they're sort of, hired, utilized to essentially come up with think tank type situations that may be addressed by the military or the intelligence community. Now, what you're talking about actually goes back to 1950, when Rand created a document titled The Exploitation of Superstitions for Purposes of Psychological Warfare. Now, this was actually written by a woman named Jean Hungerford, and essentially it was a document designed to explain to the military, the government, the intelligence community, how the world of the supernatural could be utilized against enemy nations, but also how psychologically it could have an effect on the general public as well. One of the examples that they talk about in the document involved a British Second World War operation where the Brits reportedly, and this gets into some really bizarre areas, where the Brits had created this sort of robotic kind of creature, if you like, which the idea was to sort of unleash it like a robot type humanoid into little villages in Italy which had been taken over or captured by the Germans during the Second World War, and to essentially spread the rumor that this creature was like some sort of devilish creature and that the Italian people needed to turn towards the west, otherwise this terrible creature would sort of wreak havoc on anyone who was sort of allied with the Nazis. And they came up with this really weird idea to create this this strange contraption, is the only way I can describe it. And to what extent it was successful or not, we don't know. But these are the sort of things they were thinking about, sort of using religion, but from the perspective of the devil, and spreading stories that the devil, is working against, the allies, and you need to come over to our side because you're allied with the devil if you're working with the Nazis, which basically they were. Anybody who was working with the Nazis was not a good person. But for the general public, they were basically saying that, if you ally yourself with the Nazis, they would unleash this contraption as a means to convince the people. But there are also a number of stories concerning the Russians, where the US and British intelligence spread stories to the effect that the Virgin Mary had been seen, or the image of the Virgin Mary had been seen following Allied tanks in the Second World War across Europe. She was seen in the sky, in the clouds. Now, it wasn't true. It was actually like a psychological warfare story to, again, boost Allied morale, so to speak, and also to lower the morale of, the Germans and the Japanese and the Italians by essentially trying to convince them that God was on the side of the Allies. And so they engage in a lot of psychological warfare experiments like this, where religion was utilized as a means to have an effect on, on warfare and those who were fighting in wars. And a couple of other examples, in the early 1960s, a man named Edward Lansdale, a high-ranking military officer, came up with a very bizarre idea in the early 1960s when the Cuban Missile Crisis was going on, or when it was looming at least. And the plan was to create, if you like, a second coming of Jesus in the skies over Cuba. And the plan was, it was, compared to today's technology, it was actually quite primitive. But the idea was to have aircraft fly in thick clouds over Cuba and essentially have these gigantic loudspeakers essentially speaking the word of God. And the plan was to project images of Jesus from the ground on the clouds, kind of like a spotlight, hitting a cloud. Now, it would have required numerous factors to have worked, in the right time at the right place. And eventually it was scrapped. But the idea of creating images in the skies of deities and gods as a means to control people and scare people, that kind of ties in with today's rumors of what's known as Project Bluebeam. Project Bluebeam is supposedly a far more sophisticated version, if you like, of this early incarnation of this planned second coming of Jesus over Cuba in the early 60s. Today we're talking about sophisticated holograms and mind control, all sorts of weird technology which might just be involved in faking not just a second coming, but faking the visions, if you like, or the appearances of numerous deities around the world from equally numerous religions as a means to sort of usher in almost like an iron-fisted religion-based future. And so, Bluebeam is sort of one of the more controversial theories, the idea that religion will be manipulated and utilized as a tool of control far more than it is right now.
And Nick, it's my understanding that where Cuba, that was going to be a project about trying to project Christ on the clouds, but that Bluebeam would be trying to do at a Walt Disney professional level, where the so-called final battle, the apocalypse between good and evil, would be taking place, and that everyone around the world would be seeing scenes, even if they didn't realize what was happening elsewhere.
Oh, yeah. I mean, Bluebeam, the stories that surround Project Bluebeam suggest sort of a worldwide manipulation and deception of the entire world population. The idea that there would be this sort of final battle and, different nations would see different gods depending on their belief systems. And one of the sort of overriding aspects of this story is the idea that as a result of the sort of this end time situation, we would have the Antichrist surface, but not a real Antichrist, but essentially, a fabricated one again, which would essentially become the new leader of the world. And everybody would follow this new religion driven by the Antichrist. And so it gets into some very bizarre and controversial areas. And, people have said to me, well, this is just too difficult to believe. But what I always do, I always point out to people that if you look back at the issue with Cuba and Edward Lansdale, this is an identical scenario, but on a far more primitive, earlier version. In other words, what Lansdale envisaged was exactly like Bluebeam. There would be images of Jesus projected onto the clouds over Cuba. There would be planes flying in the clouds, broadcasting what was supposedly the voice of Jesus, and telling the Cuban people to renounce Fidel Castro and come over to a westernized, culture and society. But as I said, back then, the technology wasn't that advanced, and so it would have required the clouds to have been in the right place at the right time on the right night. They'd have to be, dense enough so people wouldn't see the aircraft, etc. So there were a lot of ifs and buts. But in saying that, the theme between what was going on in Cuba in the early 60s and Bluebeam today, the parallels are so close as to be almost identical. It's just today the technology to allow this to happen is far more available than it was back in the 60s. So today, is when we really have to worry about things like that.
Have you ever had a whistleblower suggest to you that the boom, metallic scraping, and trumpet sounds that began in 2011 and continue to this day, even increasing in 2017, might be related to a test by some human technology, or could be related to the actual interdimensional penetration of something that is taking time to manifest here?
I've never had a whistleblower or any insider say anything like that to me, but I have seen those, accounts that have been, you can find all across the internet, these strange sort of bellowing trumpet noises that people have reported in the skies and underground, and some of them, they do sound really kind of creepy and ominous. You can understand why people are unsettled by this, and certainly one of the theories, an intriguing theory that's been put forward, is that this is sort of a test, if you like, to see how people react on a smaller scale, unleashing a few aspects of the technology and sit back and see what the word is on the web, what are people saying about this? What do people think it is? How is it affecting them? And I think that's a good way for whoever's doing this. It's a good way for them to be able to understand and figure out the way in which this could have an effect on people is by doing it localized and small scale to start with. Because if you do it localized and small, you have a small body of people, and it's easy to monitor them. You just focus on several little towns, and you just sit back to see how the news and the internet and everything else spreads the story. That would then give you a very good idea as to how, in all likelihood, people would react on a worldwide scale as well. But by doing it small scale to begin with, then whoever's doing it, as I said, it gives them the opportunity to really look carefully as to how this could work or not. And the way in which so much anger and confrontation and wars are based around religion, you could easily see how if something like Bluebeam was unleashed, then you could understand how the world would plunge into chaos. And I think that's supposedly part of the whole agenda of Bluebeam, is to cause everybody to collapse into chaos. And then you have sort of the Antichrist who comes along and says, I'll put it all right. That's the idea. And people would flock to this fabricated Antichrist and usher in this new world, so to speak.
Are you feeling strongly that whatever is occurring in this revolutionary time, that the direction that something, and I'm going to use the word sinister, like Peter Levenda's Sinister Forces, that something sinister is actually trying to take control and hold of the earth against something in the power of light that is actually trying to fend it off?
Well, I think a lot of people think that, actually. The idea that, that the world is just kind of plunging into chaos, and every day, there's something different. There's mass shootings all the time. I mean, I've spoken to actually a few people who believe that there's sort of almost like a supernatural vibe of negativity, which is provoking, so much chaos in the world, that it's not just, the human race just being, warlike ways. That I've spoke to more than a few people who believe that there genuinely is some sort of dangerous, malignant, negative force that's got its grips into us, whatever you term it, whether you term it from a religious perspective or a ufological perspective, or, New World Order, or something that, intertwines all of them. But as I said, I've spoken to more than a few people who believe that there is some sort of in simple terms, like a supernatural vibe, which is causing so much of the chaos that, the world's in now, and just the crazy way things are going, and almost like we're spiraling down to destruction, and everybody's almost expecting it, or accepting it even.
I talked with a physicist who worked at Area 51, worked at China Lake for real on all matters related to back engineering of extraterrestrial technology. And he told me a concept I have only encountered through him, and this has been in the past 18 months. And his concept, in the simplest sentence from hours of discussion, is that what Earth humans are missing and that they should be educated about, and he thinks it's a travesty that we are living on a planet that is so concocted and kept under these policies of lies and denial by, let's say, that 1%. And that he said in all of the physics work that he had done on the back engineering of extraterrestrial technology for real, that from his point of view, this is a reality, that the dimension closest to this matter world, and he said, as far as he knows, there's hundreds, there could be thousands, he doesn't know if there's a cap of dimensions that are related to this universe. But the one that is closest, we in the world, in evolution, have called the astral plane. And he said there are many beyond there. And as far as he's concerned, the machinery of the universe, it does involve the recycling of souls, that it isn't mythological or religious. But he said he has hard proof that whatever it is about the astral plane, the dimension closest to this matter, that there are forces, sinister forces in it that are always trying to co-opt Earth in order to enter the matter world. Have you ever encountered that as a concept?
Yes, I have. I mean, this sort of goes back to a lengthy conversation, well, not a conversation, but about 2 days of interviews that I did with Ray Boucher, who, we both know. And for people who don't know, Ray is a priest, but also somebody who's been a long-time UFO researcher and was actually a MUFON state director for the state of Nebraska.
And has a PhD in theology.
That's right, yep. And Ray had this weird experience in 1991 when he was approached by a couple of physicists within the Department of Defense who said they were working on this program to contact and essentially kind of almost like do Faustian pacts and deals with these entities that they called non-human entities, which, some people might call them aliens, some might call them interdimensional, who knows. But the story that Ray got, and, very disturbing one, the idea of trying to either do a deal to weaponize the technology for us or to somehow enter into a pact with them, so that we would have their powers or they may help us in some fashion. But, Ray told me how a lot of the people involved in this program fell sick and there was weird runs of bad luck and there were deaths almost as if, they literally had opened sort of a supernatural doorway to something that was definitively negative in nature. And the DOD guys, the two physicists that spoke with Ray, they basically wanted his help to close the door that had been opened. What could they do? What were these entities which they assumed initially were extraterrestrial, and then over time they came to think they were something that was connected with science, but also connected with religion and the afterlife and dangerous supernatural entities. So I think, there's no doubt in my mind that the UFO phenomenon goes far beyond just nuts and bolts UFOs and take me to your leader type aliens. There's this weirder supernatural aspect that does involve high technology, but which also involves the afterlife as well in ways that we don't fully understand, and which may actually be quite terrifying if we actually really did get the answers,
And the physicist in the last 18 months has convinced me that we are dealing with something that is other dimensional, and it is coming somehow. It looks for ways to get into our XYZ, the matrix here, and that one of the ways, he said without question, that they can provoke this in order for entry into this dimension is through fission of the atom, which is the atomic bomb, which is a destruction at the atomic level, and that they in that astral dimension can take advantage of fission to get into this matter world universe, and that they might be the ones who have provoked and put the E equals MC squared in Einstein's mind.
Well, when it comes to things like atomic weapons and nuclear war, that's sort of a staple part of a lot of the visions that alien abductees get. The idea. I could not tell you how many people I've spoken to in the abduction field, abductees, who report sort of future events where they've described like a global nuclear war, but bizarrely, it's not just involving, us and the Russians or whoever, but people have reported seeing in these dreams or visions of the future, seeing UFOs soaring across the skies, over the ruined cities, etc., which are, clearly not our aircraft or anybody else's. I've got a lot of stories like that where abductees have spoken about an Armageddon type situation, but there seems to be a UFO component to it as well, and also sort of an end of all times and Judgment Day kind of thing coming into play, where you've got sort of old world religion mixing with high advanced technology and mixing with some sort of apocalyptic Armageddon type situation, all coming from abductees.
And John Burroughs, the terahertz that you and I have studied so much and affected you in Rendlesham, I'm wondering if that very strange high frequency that was apparently there in Rendlesham that we read in the Condign report could manipulate minds and impact people's tissue. If terahertz might be one of the key frequencies that scientists and governments are working with because they're trying to have some interface with this dimension next door called the astral.
I don't know, but do you, in your research, because you talk about New World Order, do you get a feeling that people inside the government, and I'm not talking about the elected president or members of Congress, but people inside the intelligence agencies and these different SAP programs realize there's going to be a change, and they're trying to head off that change and would use the technology wherever we got it from to affect us so that they would still have control over us? instead of whatever's coming, would then gain control?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can sort of look at it from two ways, John. I mean, one would be, hopefully, if there is some sort of one day, like a massive opening up of the phenomenon itself, showing itself to us, that the best scenario would be that it's beneficial, that it's positive, and that it's friendly. It could be, completely different. It could be something demonstrably dangerous, or it could also be completely, ambivalent to us. We may not be something significant other than to whatever their agenda is. But I think what it all comes down to is that governments don't want to see, no government, of any country wants to see the status quo or the order of the land changed. And that's an important thing. The idea that we might suddenly have a new sort of paradigm and a new outlook on reality, on ourselves, and we move away from, the conventions of society of school, birth, school, work, retirement, death, and which is what most people go through, everybody goes through, but it's what you do in that time. And I think, certainly there's this, as I see it at least, a scenario where the idea of dumbing down society to lessen people's questioning of this or questioning of that, or just being totally ignorant of that. I think there is an agenda to try and increase that. And I think that would relate to any kind of benevolent intelligence that might come here. It might be presented to us by, whoever's in power as something dangerous and threatening. It may actually be dangerous and threatening to the order of government, but it might actually be quite beneficial to the people, to have a new outlook on life. So I think the idea of governments being frightened of some unearthly force changing society, I think they are worried about that. But from our perspective, it could actually be a positive thing. But maybe somebody would essentially try and manipulate it to look like something completely evil,
Well, because here's the thing that stands out to me. 5G is going to be dangerous, and I don't think people understand that. They look at it as just a technical advance, but in reality, that particular technology can be actually used to manipulate minds. And once they get that online and get it into the major cities where they're going first, they can use that as like a reverse technology. But when you brought up are they experimenting or blue beam? I probably won't set well with a lot of the people that follow the Phoenix Lights, but I have some insight based on the fact that I didn't see it that night, but I was in the Air Force Station at Luke. One of those triangular objects landed at Luke. And the thing is that I believe personally from some of the research I did that we were conducting testing like blue beam at that particular point on a major city. And one of the reasons why I believe that is because if you look at the area as far as close to New Mexico, and then you have Arizona and California and the different bases and technologies in that areas, that would be a perfect area, especially where most people don't know about what goes down at Gila Bend. Then you go down off the range and you get into California and into New Mexico. And a lot of stuff also was seen coming down from Nevada, which borders Arizona too. That would have been a perfect area to do a large-scale test in that particular manner to see how people react to objects in the sky like what appeared that night.
John, since I interviewed about 6 people who saw the big triangle, this is the first thing in night, starting at 7 p.m. Arizona time, and the estimates were that it was 2 miles long, a triangle, and 3 people in a car saw very sophisticated grooves in the base of this big triangle that was black otherwise. would we have the ability to project a hologram of a 2-mile long triangle in which people in a car could see huge details?
Well, I think you answered that earlier with your first question. I mean, what would be the effect on people with terahertz radiation if they were affected close to what it was? I'll give you an example. I didn't see it that night, but it flew. One of them came from Davis-Monthan, from the area of Davis-Monthan, Tucson, came across over Casa Grande and came over the southeast end of the valley over Ahwatukee area, which is where I lived. A friend of mine who lived in that area was outside and saw it come over. Now, he didn't describe it that large of an object, but it came right over the top of South Mountain. And I don't know if anybody knows that it doesn't live in the area where South Mountain is, but that's exactly the area where all the technology is put up there. They've got all the communications and stuff. And it wasn't dark, and it basically blacked out that area, but it wasn't 2 miles. But in fact, if you're using this EM terrorist technology, can you ever really get a true definition of what you're seeing?
What do you think, Nick?
Well, I think the most important and significant thing with relation to the Phoenix Lights is whoever was flying it, they clearly wanted to be seen. Now, that's something that is at odds with most UFO cases, the genuine cases. The phenomenon itself is very stealthy and elusive, and it's sort of here 1 second and gone the next second. Abductees have their minds wiped clean. So in other words, it stays very much in the background. And that's the big difference between most of the UFO phenomenon and the Phoenix Lights. That the Phoenix Lights, whoever's flying them, piloting them, however you want to term it, they clearly wanted to be seen. And if they wanted to be seen, then clearly they also wanted a reaction. And they got a reaction. You only had to see the news media of the time. So, in other words, kind of like I mentioned earlier, by testing something like this over a populated but also localized area, and then monitoring the news media, TV, radio, newspapers, conspiracy sites, etc., you could easily and very quickly gauge what the local population thought about it all, what the theories were, and then you could demonstrate how, well, if we could do this on a worldwide scale, we're going to get the same sort of reactions. So I think, a good case can be made that this was like a psychological test to see how the people in that area would respond, and then it would give them a good idea, at least, as to how the rest of the planet would also respond in a similar situation. So I think this is like an ongoing, slow process. It's not like blue beam, something that's going to be unleashed immediately. It's taking decades to put this together, before they get to the checkmate situation that we hope they don't get to,
Well, here's something else to add to that, though, because I lived out there for quite a few years. If you went out in the south of Ahwatukee and went towards a town called Maricopa that was built up during the last big boom, you could see out over the range in Gila Bend numerous times that type of activity was taking place out over there. I saw it on more than one occasion. And then also there was a connection with Sedona. And if you go up there, and I lived there for 2 years, there are things that take place in the sky that just can't be explained. And there is a strong possibility there's a military facility up there.
And for both of you is this bottom line issue. What if everything from blue beam to trying to do a test at the Phoenix Lights or whatever has happened? What if it is because we have hard, firm information that there are one or more other intelligences in the Milky Way galaxy that have an awareness of Earth, may have been involved in Earth, and that they come back periodically, and our government is trying to anticipate something that could show up?
Linda, let's take that answer after the break. We'll do our first break.
Right. Thank you, John. Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Nick. Folks, don't go anywhere. We'll be right back with our very special guest tonight, the return of Nick Redfern. Don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be right back after this brief message. Stay with us.
This is KGRA Digital Broadcasting Station. Salt Lake City, Utah. Van Buren, Arkansas.
UFOcongress.com is where you go to check out the Guinness World Records largest UFO conference. The next event is going to be held February 14th through the 18th, 2018. At UFOcongress.com, you'll find out why so many people go to the UFO Congress. It's because we have the best speakers, the most amazing venue, and very affordable prices. Don't forget the website's UFOcongress.com. We look forward to seeing you at the next International UFO Congress.
Sure, humans can be a little weird at times, but take it from me, I'm a dog. And a person is about the best thing that can happen to a shelter pet. So if you want to learn how you can be that person, get down to your local pet shelter or visit theshelterpetproject.org. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Do you worry a lot? Whether you're a college student, busy professional, parent, or grandparent, ongoing stress and elevated levels of the stress hormone cortisol can rob your memory, your health, and your future. Now you can combat the effects of stress and anxiety while improving your memory and recall at the same time with the dietary supplement Calm and Clever. Studies show that the ingredients in Calm and Clever reduce cortisol by as much as 30% in 1 to 2 weeks. Call 1-800-758-8746 or calmandclever.com.
Around the world for decades have come high strangeness reports of mysterious aerial lights, beams, animal mutilations, human abductions, secret space and military programs focused on an alien presence. One reporter of these Earth mysteries is Emmy Award-winning TV producer, writer, and editor Linda Moulton Howe. She reports and edits the science, environment, and real X-Files news website, Earthfiles.com.
We are moving from the paradigm that we are alone in the universe to a new one in which we are not alone. And something out there is interacting with us, our animals and plant life, forcing glimpses of other realities upon us.
Linda has produced 4 large books about these phenomena with hundreds of color images and illustrations that reviewers such as New York Times best-selling author Jim Marrs describes as an amazing accumulation of evidence. All her books, An Alien Harvest, the 2-volume Glimpses of Other Realities, and Mysterious Lights and Crop Circles, along with documentaries, are available in the shop at earthfiles.com.
As you know, recently we've been dealing with many natural disasters, and a lot of people have lost contact with their loved ones for days, even weeks. Others in the most vulnerable moments were unable to contact emergency services and call for help because of these potentially life-threatening circumstances from hurricanes, fires, earthquakes, and even rogue nations such as North Korea. Satellite Phone Store made satellite phones an affordable solution to being prepared when all communications are cut off. Satellite phones don't rely on cell phone towers, and they work anywhere under the open sky. Satellite Phone Store will give you a free Inmarsat iSat Phone 2 satellite phone with a monthly subscription on select service plans with enough time to provide you with reliable communications between your family and emergency services when you need it the most. To learn more, call 877-705-8839 or go to satellitephonestore.com. Supplies are limited, so call today, 877-705-8839 to hear all options and stay prepared.
Your contact for current news and trending topics. KGRAradio.com.
You're listening to Phenomenon Radio live on KGRA Digital Broadcast Station, Van Buren, Arkansas, Salt Lake City, Utah. Before we can begin hour 2 of tonight's excellent interview with Nick Redfern on Phenomenon Radio Live, it's time for the news, and it's brought to you exclusively by Earthfiles.com. Here's Linda Moulton Howe. Linda?
Thank you, Race. Nick and John, before the commercial break, I was asking, what if the idea of theater, something like trying this out in the Phoenix Lights, would be related to some information that our government, perhaps other governments have and shares, that something out there in the Milky Way galaxy has cycled its presence in this solar system and on this planet through millennia, and that something out there could be coming back?
Well, I don't dispute that as a possibility at all. I mean, just to go back quickly to Ray Boucher, and when he was trying to be speaking to these DOD guys who were trying to contact these so-called non-human entities, that kind of suggests a situation where things had gone from just investigating UFO sightings, but to actually trying to interact with something out there as if they'd made a contact with them. And if that is the case, then bear in mind this is back in the early 90s. Well, we're talking almost 30 years ago now. Possibly, the phenomenon has kind of interacted further and deeper in ways that we don't even know. So I think, there's a very good, solid possibility that the phenomenon is becoming more interactive, not necessarily directly, but perhaps in an indirect way that's, is impacting on us in a negative fashion. The whole idea of, you mentioned these bizarre sounds. The one thing that I find from a lot of these stories is that these sounds really unsettle people. They create like a nervous situation. They're disturbed by them. And I wonder if that's just because they don't know what it is, or if, something is being tested on us. But yeah, I think if somebody in government or, in some sort of global elite knows that something's coming back, and that whatever that thing is, that it's going to affect civilization, they will do whatever they can to retain the power they've got.
Well,
so I think
Nick,
a lot of this, yeah.
I wanted to say something as you were adding that into it, what struck me. Robert Bigelow, everybody knows about his 60-minute interview, but 2 years ago, or about 3 years ago, he did an interview with George Knapp, and they were talking about what was to come. And what Bigelow said was that we were going to have confirmation, not disclosure, but he highlighted the fact that what's coming, we will no longer be able to keep secret. Could that be, is he saying that because these noises are from somewhere else and they know they were going to come and they can't keep them secret, do you think? Or is it just he was setting us up so when they did start happening, people would think they were coming from somewhere else?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say, but what I would say for sure, as I see it at least, is that if there is something coming to the Earth that is so incredibly advanced, in terms of, from our perspective, to the point where it's almost impossible to understand their science and technology, there's no way it could be hidden. If the phenomenon wants to show itself open to us, there's nobody on the planet can stop that from happening. And so I think part of it is going to be down to the phenomenon. I just don't see how, even some sort of global elite would have the power to prevent this phenomenon from showing itself if it chose to. And now, of course, the big question is if it chooses to show itself to us, what are we going to be exposed to? Is it going to be sort of an entirely new paradigm-changing way of looking at life? Is it going to be something deadly and dangerous, or is it something that would be beneficial? I think the problem is we have a lot of questions and theories, and the answers are still kind of eluding us. But what I would say, there's no doubt that there are a lot of sinister and disturbing aspects connected to the genuine UFO phenomenon. If you take out the blue beam kind of stuff out of the equation, there is some genuinely disturbing stuff that, like I said earlier, goes far beyond just nuts and bolts UFOs and gets into some very thought-provoking areas, like life after death, the nature of the soul, what the government may know about soul recycling, and all this kind of stuff, which I don't think they want out in the public domain because of the life-changing effect it's going to have on people.
Nick, remember when Ray got in touch with me about the DIA NSA agents that had approached him, and they wanted a copy of my book, Glimpses of Other Realities. They wanted the second volume, which has a whole huge chapter about what abductees call the resurrection technology or cloning technology. And in that 92 to 1994 time period, I was exchanging floppy disks then that Ray gave them my street address. They would send a floppy. I sent them a copy of my book, and we had quite a dialogue. And I still remember the first communication in which I was reading where they were describing the phenomenon that they were concerned about as NHEs, and they defined it as non-human entities, and they also referred to them as HAVs, hostile. And one of the sentences in their description that we were dealing with deception was that the intelligence that we are dealing with, quote, is neither benign nor neutral.
Well, yeah, and that gets to the heart, I think, of a lot of UFO encounters. You know, when you talk about deceived and deception and not being what they seem to be, that actually ties in with a lot of UFO cases where they seem to be staged events. I mean, if you look back in the 50s, there are numerous cases of people driving down the road and they suddenly see these aliens taking soil samples and they run back to their ship and take off. Well, it's kind of like, how many times are the aliens going to make a mistake and they get seen taking all these soil samples? It's almost like it's a staged event for the witness to create or to continue to expand, like the extraterrestrial meme of scientists taking soil samples. But to me, they come across like staged events. And I think a lot of UFO landing cases seem to be like staged events as well, to again instill in us the idea of extraterrestrials that are fairly benevolent. But if, as Ray sources suggested, the idea that this is something deceptive, well, the best way to deceive us is by staging things which are going to push us down one particular belief system. And I think like a lot of people, when I got into all this as a kid, I thought it was extraterrestrial. Then over time I came to think, because of these crossovers with like psychic phenomena, life after death, that we're dealing with something so weird that it frightens those in power because they understand they don't have any control over it and they cannot control it.
And Nick, that would be jumping over to that astral dimension that parallels this universe. But even the physicist who was talking to me about the revelations there, he was working on physically back engineering extraterrestrial biological entity technologies at Area 51 in China Lake, and that there is a mixture. That means that we have extraterrestrial interaction and we have other dimensional, and we might possibly truly have other timeline.
Yeah, and I think this is where it gets confusing. It probably got confusing for the government when they first looked into it. I think, there are a lot of people in ufology who take the very simple approach that whoever's coming here, they're just like somebody else's equivalent of NASA, but it's not. Yes, there's a technology angle to it and a physicality to these craft and the entities, but it doesn't just begin and end with that. It does cross over into the paranormal, the occult, the supernatural, life after death. And so in other words, this phenomenon is so weird because it interlinks so many different phenomenon. It's not like, just somebody, like I said, like somebody else's equivalent of NASA where it's just scientists and technology. It isn't. It gets into some really bizarre areas. I remember Ray telling me that how the guys working on this program in the Pentagon, on the DIA, etc., they were consulting like 500-year-old books on demonology, to try and get some of the answers from there, rather than just focusing on the science of things.
Right.
And that's a good indication, of how weird the phenomenon really is.
And Nick, one of the books, because I called them the writers in my book, Glimpses of Other Realities. And what the writers sent me in one of the floppy disks was a list of books that they said would be a critical insight to what they were trying to describe and what we were dealing with, at least some of what we were dealing with. And I went to the University of Pennsylvania that had an inter-university loan with Harvard and Oxford and basically around the world. And I put in the request for the books. The University of Pennsylvania, as I recall, only had 2 or 3 physical books of the list. And one of them, fortunately, was there at the University of Pennsylvania, and I was able to get somebody who went to the stacks and brought that book to me. It was a large book, like 24 by 13 or something like that. And they had guided me in the floppy disk where to go and what to look for. And on 1 or 2 of the pages in a section having to do with the demonology of Mesopotamia and Babylonia, there were these were stone sculptures. I'd never seen them anywhere on the planet, but they're in that book, and that's what the writers wanted me to see. They are stone, and they look exactly like if you took something like a torso from the ground up to about where we would call the chest, and then what unfolded was a reptile, a snake, a serpent on 3 of these stone edifices, each with a different face.
Well, I remember one of the books that Ray told me that they were consulting. It was actually a book from 1601. It was John Deacon and John Walker's book. It was called Dialogical Discourses of Spirits and Devils. So, this bizarre situation of these guys in the NSA and the DIA trying to contact these NHEs and reading 17th century books on demonology to try and figure out what it was they were dealing with. And I think this is why it probably blows the minds of so many people who know the secrets and who are, trying to figure out what to do with it, And I think, unfortunately, a lot of the people in the know who really understand what's going on, they're not the people we should be having in power or, influencing us. That they're almost as bad as, I'm not talking about the NSA and the DIA here. I'm talking about the string pullers, this 1% elite, if you like. They're the ones, I think, who are fully in the know of the history of the ancient history of the planet and of the human race and of what's to come. So, we're facing potentially a dangerous phenomenon from elsewhere, and we've also got a dangerous 1%, if you like, that's in a very different fashion is equally a threat to us.
And in collaboration, because if some of the 1% are the they that could be coming in some form, then it's a collaboration with that which is of the unknown. And in your book, in the chapter that is Putin, Trump, and the New World Order, it's under the letter P in the alphabet in your sequence. And you made a very interesting point here. You said just a couple of days after the Brexit affair in Europe, the voting for England to leave the European Union, that the media reported on how none other than Russian Premier Vladimir Putin sent a warning to none other than Donald Trump, warning Trump that the NWO, the New World Order, was gunning for him, Trump, and that a, quote, secret cabal, close quote, within the New World Order had Trump quote, in their crosshairs, close quote, and that Putin's specific words to Trump at the time of Brexit were, quote, there is a secret cabal above the elected rulers of your country, meaning the U.S. They have very clear goals for the next couple of years. So that would be 17, 18, 19. They do not want you to be president, and they are conspiring against you, close quote. So I'm bringing this up. One, he got elected. But if this is true, if this is a Putin report that came from someplace credible, what do you think exactly Putin was warning about? And what do you think happened that Trump did become president?
Well, yeah, Putin actually did say that. Those were his genuine words. And I think what this demonstrates more than any other, it's a perfect example of how you can have powerful figures running nations, and yet they realize that there's somebody above them, a group of people who are so elusive, so mysterious, and so hidden. And yet also they have the ability to manipulate entire nations, which really demonstrates, the power that this elite has when you have, major forces around the world like Putin saying there are these cabals and we're powerless to stop them.
But how did Trump get elected?
I think he got elected because the people elected him. But what I think is probably the cabal were not expecting him to get elected. I think they probably have their limits on what they can do. They can create trends and ideas and put thoughts in people's minds to, you should go this way or that way in terms of voting. But I think possibly for that elite, as well as for many of the public, it was, they weren't expecting him to win.
But Nick, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Okay. And it's a couple questions, a couple things I want to bring up, which I was wondering about and get your thoughts on when you said they didn't expect him to win. Number one, right after the primaries, before the general election, I'll never forget this, and it's on the interview's on YouTube to look at. Bill O'Reilly, when he was still at Fox, was interviewing Newt Gingrich, and he asked why Trump wasn't being accepted. And I couldn't believe what I heard, but he said because he hasn't been read into the secret society yet. He flat out used those words. He has not been read in. Now, fast forward to that. I don't know how much you watch the news, but there's been two particular moments. One of them was the day the Russians were in the White House. And that was when they had that big thing come out about Trump said something about national security, about national security. And there was another time when there's a foreign dignitary visiting. Both times, guess who was sitting next to him? Henry Kissinger. And Henry Kissinger goes right down to the core of the elite, in my opinion.
Well, yeah, I mean, again, this sort of demonstrates where you have these figures, not necessarily hidden in the background, but just quietly working, and getting this done and getting that done. And governments just sort of trundle along as they always have done, not realizing how, sort of belief systems and ideas are being subtly altered and trends are being created to influence people to think this or to think that. And it's kind of, it's almost scary as to how easily the public and even governments can be manipulated by a powerful force that operates outside of the conventions of government.
Do you think a couple things I wanted to bring up why Trump may have got elected? Do you feel, in your opinion, the push by Podesta and his group to disclose what they could and Hillary came on TV and said, we're going to go into the new terminology, UAPs, and we're going to try to open it up unless it's not of huge national security value or whatever. Do you think, because you can't help but when Comey came out and did that, say they were reopening the investigation again, do you think because of the fact that Podesta, they believe Podesta was going to push for this and Hillary would support it, do you think somebody inside felt it was better off putting Trump in power, at least short term, because of that threat that something may actually be disclosed by pressure put on by Podesta and by Hillary?
Well, it's hard to say for sure, but what I would say for sure, in my opinion at least, I think when that announcement was made that there was going to be another investigation into Hillary Clinton, and this was right before the election, there's no doubt in my mind that that massively influenced millions of people not to vote for her. I'm absolutely sure that, it had the absolute opposite effect. It pushed people further away. And I think on top of that, you had millions of people who wanted a change, and they viewed that from their perspective, they viewed what Donald Trump was offering was something radically different, and they were tired of the same old thing. I think part of it is it just doesn't come down to conspiracy. I think a lot of it comes down to human nature, that how he got elected, that people, when, it said, well, people wanted a change, I think that's what happened. Now, I'm not a fan of, Donald Trump. For me, the one person who could have saved things, I think, was Bernie himself, and that didn't happen,
but that would take us to socialism. And to me, that's what they're going to need to have happen before they can control us.
Well, again, I mean, it's sort of difficult to see the big picture. I think in terms of the election itself, I think you had, a substantial number of people who wanted Clinton to win, a substantial number who wanted Trump to win, and there were various factors that came along, like, for example, we're opening another investigation of Hillary. There were critical things like that, and also the fact that, Trump was approaching the election in a very different and alternative way to so many other, potential candidates were. And I think, and again, as I said, I'm not a supporter of Trump, but I think people were intrigued by the fact that this is somebody running for president who's totally unlike any other candidate. And people were, I think, unhappy with the regular running of government. And I think they just thought, let's give him a try. And I think that's, in my perspective, that's what happened.
Right. But I can't help but wonder this. Okay, here she was winning. They put that tape out of Trump in what he said to that reporter and all that other stuff. He was down. I mean, it was almost like it's over. Then Comey, who worked for inside the Justice Department and was protecting Hillary the whole time, throws that bombshell out about 2 weeks before. Everything shifts. Then when he gets elected, what does Comey do? Then he throws coals on Trump with the Russian thing, which now they have a special counsel. And what I find interesting, and I'm watching this, and this has nothing to do with UFOs, but I just could wonder if maybe because of Podesta and what he was going to try to do, that's maybe why they finally said, no, we're not going to let her be in charge. But then you turn around and you look at what Comey did going out the door on Trump. But if you've noticed, Trump more and more goes along with the New World Order, which I think is the industrial military complex. I think that involves the alphabet soup agencies, and that's where the control is based on that, and also the major corporate people. In the old days, it was Rockefeller and those guys, but there's a new breed of corporate control, and it comes and that controls within the alphabet soup agencies. And they made sure that Trump, even though he not won the popular vote, was elected by the people, was not going to be able to come in and just destroy everything either.
But he is destroying everything.
No, he's not, Linda. He's doing everything he said he did. He's securing the borders. The economy is going to go through the roof. Okay? There's nothing he's done in the last 10 months that's hurt this country. And that's the problem I have. I mean, I'm not a big Trump fan, but the economy is going to go through the roof. We're going to get a tax cut. And the fact of the matter is, he's securing the borders. What has he done to destroy the country?
Well, let me pose the question differently, because right now on the planet, the big stress point is North Korea. And I'm really curious, Nick, if you have a perspective in this whole issue of a new world order, 1% that have control and influence, and that some of those may be non-humans. What do you think is the reason that Kim Jong-un is doing all of these demonstrations with nuclear weapons? And now I'm asking in the context of this larger box of forces, both sinister and ally, that seem to be trying to fight over and get the minds and souls of humanity. So who could be provoking Kim Jong-un to be threatening the world now with these missiles?
Well, I mean, I think we're in a dangerous situation where nuclear weapons are dangerous at any time. But for me, at least, I think it comes just down to him. I think he's goading. He wants to be a big player on the planet. He's outside of the box looking in. I mean, he's inside looking out, but he wants to be like a big player. And I think he realizes that that nobody really wants a nuclear war, and he's pushing it to the brink as far as I think he feels he can go, to make himself look good and tough. And of course, it's difficult how to respond. I mean, one of the interesting things, I actually had a chat with a retired soldier who's in the Gulf, and he actually mentioned something to me that a lot of people don't think about. And he said, but behind the scenes the military does think about, is that because North Korea is so close to the border of China, that if North Korea was nuked, the sheer speed and massive blast that comes from an atomic bomb, the radiation would just soar all across the border into China, and you would have tens of thousands of Chinese people killed in the wake of the attack on North Korea, because it's right over they border each other. Radiation doesn't sort of stop for borders. And so the guy basically said to me, one of the reasons they don't want to go to war but with North Korea, but they're willing to shout and scream, is because if tens of thousands of Chinese people are killed as a result of a nuclear attack on North Korea, then it's going to bring China in. China's not going to sit back if 20,000 of their citizens just over the border in China are irradiated and dead, in 5 days or whatever. It's going to escalate.
Well, anybody that believes that North Korea developed these weapons is a fool. They were giving the weapons probably both by China and Russia. Okay. And the interesting thing about everybody freaking out over this has been going on back when Clinton was president, Bill Clinton was president. And the funny thing was, they were sold the very technology from Rumsfeld's company that developed these nuclear weapons in the first place.
Raytheon.
Yes. And we gave them the ability to make a bomb, and the missile technology didn't get developed in North Korea. Everything North Korea gets comes from China and Russia. So there is a power play going on, but I'm not trying to make this a political show, but the last 7 or 8 years, right? I mean, North Korea's been allowed to do whatever they want. So how much longer do you let them, develop these missiles and start sending them over to Japan before you have to say enough's enough? You know what I mean?
No, I agree with you on that point. That it's like, how do you stop it? Well, you could stop it by using nukes. But then if you use nukes, there's a potential for it to escalate. So, but yeah, I mean, the ideal scenario would be that in the first place, he was never allowed to actually have nukes in the first place. You know, he was stopped in his tracks before he had anything other than tanks, aircraft, and, you know, a few missiles. There wouldn't have been a problem. You know, it's when, you know, it's like somebody who has cancer and doesn't go to the doctor. Well, you know, you leave it longer and longer, and it's too late. And that's kind of a similar analogy. You know, he should have been stopped before any of this even began in the first place. But I honestly don't have an answer to how we resolve it now. You know, I mean, he doesn't seem to want to back down.
Well, can you blame him? I mean, can you blame him for one reason? Saddam Hussein supposedly did, and Gaddafi did, and look where it ended up for them. I mean, they both were eliminated, and Gaddafi got scared after what happened in Iraq, handed open his weapons, and he was eliminated. So I'm not sticking up for this guy in North Korea by any means, but part of his thinking has to be, if I give this up, then what's going to happen to me? You know what I mean?
No, you're right, and I think, you know, that's why it's such a fraught situation as to what should be done versus what can be done or, you know, shouldn't be done. I just don't know. I mean, you know, it's the one thing you can say about it, everything about it just seems unpredictable. You know, it's
right. But I think some of the problems is the news media itself, and what I mean is we're being manipulated into things that are not as bad as they appear to be a lot of times. Do you know what I mean? And we're being pushed to look at certain things when in reality, my personal opinion is people should be scared to death that the United States is $20 trillion in debt and it continues to grow. Do you know what I mean? How much longer can this country survive with that kind of debt? But all this other stuff is a sidebar. And not only that, but is North Korea just there and they allow this to continue to justify the amount of military spending that we have every year?
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, that's a good argument. I just, you know, but I guess I'm just sort of more looking at it from the literal angle of what we know, you know, of this guy who's dangerous, you know, just outright dangerous, and he's got his little nuclear toy box, you know, or he will have. You know, I mean, regardless of how there may be manipulations and things going on behind the scenes, that's where we're at now, you know. There's this sort of almost like a nuclear face-off, so to speak.
Nick, if there has been a question thrown into the whole issue of what is the UFO phenomena and its relationship to this planet and the solar system and beyond for real, and that in that discussion at a bigger box level, there's even a question about a non-human force putting into Albert Einstein's head the E equals MC squared and other things in order to move us along that track. Why couldn't the same question be asked about somebody like Kim Jong-un in North Korea, that something from, say, that Astral or what the NSA DIA guy talking to Ray and me called that they were hostile. So why couldn't something like this guy in North Korea be another example of mental manipulation by outside forces?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because a few months ago I wrote an article for Mysterious Universe all about a lot of people who contacted me over the previous sort of 3 or 4 months, where they've been having sort of apocalyptic dreams of various US cities, and particularly Chicago, hit by atomic weapons. And it was all tied in with UFOs and nuclear confrontations. And when I wrote that article, it literally prompted altogether through Facebook messages, email, etc. Probably, but now the figure's more than 100. It's definitely more than 100 people who've said in the last few months they've had these dreams or nightmares of seeing American cities destroyed, predominantly Chicago. which, was one of the early cities that was suggested that North Korea could reach. And I think probably now, I think 14 or 15 of those, in excess of 100 people, 14 or 15 of those people are abductees, alien abductees. And they were having graphic dreams. One guy had a very graphic dream of an atomic explosion in Lubbock, Texas, just took out the entire city. And he was an abductee, and he tied it in with North Korea. And people have also tied it in with sightings of the Mothman, this sort of harbinger of doom kind of thing, which there have been numerous sightings around Chicago. So, you can actually make a case that, this whole issue of nuclear standoffs, etc., does have a UFO component to it, and particularly in these sort of nightmarish dream situations with abductees.
And going all the way back to Betty and Barney Hill, 61, and coming forward, the number of abductees that have told me that they have been shown on a screen or a hologram the Earth. They recognize it as the Earth, as if they're being shown it from outside of, up in the atmosphere, out toward the moon or someplace far enough to see. And that this is what's interesting to me, that over a period of time, probably I heard this description a dozen times over a period from around 79 to around 89 or 90, where they said, and it looks like the sky is on fire, literally fire. The atmosphere is on fire. And that is something, a theme that has been in the abduction literature all the way from the 60s on.
Yeah, and I think, this pattern of abductees having, sort of Armageddon-type images, dreams, nightmares, etc., visions, but I do kind of find it disturbing and unsettling that it's happening on a large scale right now, with these people tying it in with North Korea. Now, some of the stories could, of course, just people are worried, and when you worry about things, it sometimes overflows into your dreams. But a lot of these stories are so graphic that they don't seem like regular dreams. And the fact that, as I said, out of this 100 and something of reports that I've got now over the last couple of months as a result of this article, the fact that 14, 15, 16, something like that, are abductees, and all of them almost made like a connection with North Korea, and primarily with Chicago. You have to kind of wonder, wow, is there Nick, some sort of connection,
But let me ask you something, okay? If you told me it was Russia or China, or I would say, okay, I would consider that. North Korea still doesn't have the capability of launching one missile yet. So why would it be North Korea? I mean,
I think because North Korea is in the news, and so it.
Well, that's what I mean. That's what I'm saying. They're believing the apocalypse could happen because of North Korea, but that's manipulation within the news that these people come on and say that they're going to have the capabilities to reach the United States and they could blow up a major city. Well, where has all these trillions of dollars that have disappeared gone? Are you saying we don't have a defense system? We can't take down a missile or two, that they can't track him when he's going to do it? Again, I think it goes back more to, I believe it's deception. I believe that they want to continue to increase defense. They want to control us through the industrial military complex. And they do it by fear, which is what Iron Mountain originally came out with in the first place. And when you go back to 1998, before 9/11 happened, they said the next threat will be terrorism, followed up by the threat from above. But it all comes down to keeping the military complex together. And does that mean then the world will unite in the military complex to fight the aliens that are coming?
Well, it's hard to say. I just, if I have answers to something, I'll tell people. I just, I try not to speculate, because speculation often people interpret it as, hard fact, when it actually isn't. But
right.
I mean, what I would say, I do find it intriguing that somewhere around sort of 20% of all the people who contacted me about these sort of nuclear dreams and nightmares of, a looming apocalypse, I mean, looming on the horizon kind of thing, that around about 20% of them were abductees. It wasn't just a random, number of people across the population. Now, that could mean something or nothing, but it may mean something significant. So, but what it means, that's the big question. But
Nick, let me ask right at that point, in your World War III, you have a quote that comes from Global Research. That's the journal. Quote, for more than a century, the globalists have been promoting their New World Order eugenics plan for a sustainable Earth population of about 500 million people. That this means within the next several years, they plan to kill 13 out of 14 of the 7.2 billion currently living and growing on the planet. Now, Jim Marrs also did that book, Depopulation, a couple of years before he passed. And that argument is that part of the deception is that forces are at work, whether they are non-human, human, or a collaboration of those two, to depopulate planet Earth of so many Homo sapiens. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's no doubt. You can look throughout history and find, particularly since the 1970s, a lot of research has been done to, claim that, the population cannot just keep growing and growing. And, there have been some controversial papers and reports put together as to how and why and justifying, a lowered population. I mean, Prince Philip, the Queen's husband, he actually made a very controversial statement. He said he would like to come back in the next life as like a deadly virus to wipe out, however many billions of people. He actually said that. So, we know that there are people who do want to get the population down and get it down drastically. I guess the big question is, if that, God forbid it happens, but if it did, how would it be achieved without causing world destruction? I mean, you couldn't do it via a nuclear war because there would be no world left anyway, even for the elite, if the entire
that's simple.
world went to war.
It's simple, okay? They put this in people's heads. North Korea could fire a missile, an E-impulse weapon, into the atmosphere, and it could take down our entire power grid. If, in fact, they did that, or that made it look like they did that, and they knocked the power grid off, this country would go into chaos and probably 80% would die, okay? And they make it sound like it would take years to bring the grid back online. Now, if they did it, then obviously we would do it. So the whole world could lose power. Imagine the chaos that would take place. And the interesting thing that bothers me the most about all this is artificial intelligence and how far they're going with, the robotics and being able to do stuff. And basically, I think the biggest question in my mind, and it stood out to me when O'Reilly was interviewing Mark Cuban, and he goes to Cuban and he says, this is great what Trump's doing. And Cuban says, it doesn't matter what he's doing. There'll be net job loss in this country, even if Trump lasts for 8 years. And O'Reilly goes, what do you mean? He says, more and more industry is going to go to AI, robotics. And he says, eventually there won't be a need for man to work. And I believe, which one was it? Musk, Linda, that said that everybody should just get a stipend and not have to work?
Well, Musk is calling artificial intelligence the existential threat to humanity. And he has now, in 3 different serious presentations this year, just since June, he has said that his greatest fear is that we are on the brink of creating artificial intelligence and cyborgs. They will go to Mars, they will go to the moon, they will become our space interface, and that humanity would eventually be replaced by the artificial intelligence. It would replace us with...
Well, most of us. Obviously, the elite probably would have their own little corner of the world. But that's the thing that concerns me, that realistically, we're moving towards robotics and having everything built by robotics and do a lot of jobs. They just came out and said they've got a small farm that they were able to completely plant and harvest without using, manpower. So if they're doing that, what is the plan, I think, at the end of the day? And where is this all going? And why are people so for the fact of this taking place, the fact that socialism is what they're pushing for? And that means the end of free will, and that means the fact that we'll eventually really be just citizens, what's left of us.
AI, that we will be just like the robots. And there's just one little piece to add here that I think is being suppressed on purpose by all governments. And that is that this summer, I was told straightforwardly by a person who is working in an Intel unit, and that they knew for a fact in Japan, in one of the AI experimental labs, that they were producing robots for security. That was the purpose. And the robots were equipped with some kind of weapon. And that a day came when 3 or 4 of the AI security robots turned on the humans in the lab and killed them. And when I was told that, they said, this is real. You're not going to see this in the media, but this is one of the things that Elon Musk is also worried about, that already AI, depending upon what it's being made for, if it's being made to be a soldier, if it is being made to be a policeman, if it is being made to be security, and all 3 categories must have weapons, there is no guarantee that humans who made them won't end up on the end of bullets. That's what this man told me happened this summer in Japan, secretly.
Yeah, I think what a lot of this comes down to is that, society and science and civilization are changing in some really weird ways in an extremely rapid fashion, that we really don't know, what the world's going to be like 10 or 20 years from now. I mean, it's really since the creation of the internet that the entire world has changed, and yes, it can be very positive in many ways. But it's like most technologies, it can be used against us. And I think that's the problem we're in today, is that, whether done deliberately or just as an unforeseen side effect, the massive increase that things like AI and instant communication, the net, everything else, it can have its good side, it can have its bad side, and invariably, the bad side can impact to a very negative degree. I mean, you look now at the increasing vanishing of newspapers. I have to admit, I get most of my news online, but, if you thought back 20 years ago, and somebody said, just 20 years from now, newspapers will be in danger of not being around anymore, people would laugh at that. And yet that's where we're at. People would not read books in the way they do anymore. They will read them online on a computer. People would laugh at that. So, I think this technology is great, but it does have its downsides, and a lot of these downsides could, lead to the fall of the human race. But I mean, without being pessimistic, but being realistic, the fact is that numerous creatures, animals that have lived on the planet don't exist anymore. The woolly mammoth, saber-toothed tigers, dinosaurs. Why should we consider ourselves to be any different. You know, we've had a good
I don't
run.
disagree,
It
Nick.
might come to that.
Right, I don't disagree, and unfortunately, we're out of time. I want to thank you for coming on.
Yeah,
Alrighty.
Nick, thank you. And let's hope we can do another show with you a year from now and that the planet is still here.
That would be good.
Thank you, Nick, Linda, and John. For John Burroughs, Linda Moulton Howe, tonight's very special and honored guest, Nick Redfern. I am Race Hobbs, thanking all of you for taking the time to join us tonight. Stay tuned for 3 hours of Jimmy Church and Fade to Black Live. It's open lines tonight, everybody, right here on Your Contact for the best paranormal talk radio on the World Wide Web. You're listening to KGRAradio.com. We'll see you next week. Have a great night and a great weekend, everybody.